August 1944, deep within the suffocating green hell of the Burmese jungle, Imperial Japanese Army Sergeant Kenji Tanaka pressed his back against the slick, moss-covered trunk of an ironwood tree, trying to become invisible. Rain, thick and warm as blood, dripped from the canopy of triple-layered leaves 100 feet above, a relentless percussion on the jungle floor that had not stopped for weeks. The air was a physical weight, a soupy mixture of humidity, decaying vegetation, and the metallic tang of fear. For Tanaka, a veteran of the campaigns in China, this was a different kind of war. This wasn't a war of bugles and banzai charges across open fields. This was a war against an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere, the jungle itself. It was an ally, he had been told. Its malaria, its dysentery, its leeches and vipers and constant soul-crushing dampness would break the soft Western soldiers. The Americans and their British allies were creatures of roads and supply depots. Here, in the primordial labyrinth of the Burma front, they would rot. Tanaka and his men were ghosts, masters of this green world. They endured. They ate roots and foraged plants when the rice ran out. They ignored the jungle sores that festered on their skin and the fevers that racked their bodies. This endurance was their sharpest weapon, a spiritual strength the materialistic Americans could never comprehend. A wounded man in Tanaka's platoon was a dead man. There was no evacuation. There was no rear hospital. There was a final grenade for the honorable, or a slow, fever-drenched surrender to the jungle for the unfortunate. It was the law of this place. Suddenly, above the ceaseless drumming of the rain, a new sound intruded. It was a pathetic noise, a low, sputtering cough like a faulty generator. It was thin, weak, utterly devoid of the menacing roar of the American P-51 Mustangs or the deep-throated growl of their B-25 bombers that occasionally scarred the sky. Tanaka and his men exchanged glances, a mixture of curiosity and contempt. They had heard this sound before, getting more frequent in recent weeks. Peering through a gap in the suffocatingly dense foliage, they saw it. A tiny airplane, looking more like a child's toy than a weapon of war, floated lazily over the canopy. It was preposterous. Its wings were made of cloth, its body a simple tube frame, its engine putting out a noise that was barely a whisper. It flew so slowly you could track it with the naked eye, a fragile dragonfly drifting through a tempest. The first time they had seen one, weeks ago, they had laughed. The Americans, in their desperation, were sending them flying kites. What could such a ridiculous machine possibly do? It carried no bombs. It had no visible guns. It seemed to barely disturb the air it passed through. The men in Tanaka's squad called it the mayfly, a creature with a life so short it was barely worth noticing. They never expected what it truly represented. They were about to witness an act that defied every law of warfare as they understood it, an expression of American power so subtle and yet so profound, it would shatter their morale more effectively than a 1,000-pound bomb. They watched as the flimsy little plane dipped its wing and began to circle a small, muddy clearing less than a kilometre away, a clearing they knew was held by a pocket of trapped American soldiers they had been hunting for days. The sputtering engine changed its pitch as the plane descended, disappearing below the treetops. Tanaka and his men waited for the sound of a crash, for the inevitable explosion of the foolish machine meeting the unforgiving jungle. But it never came. There was only the rain, the drone of insects, and a stunned, unsettling silence. The Japanese High Command in Burma had built their entire strategy around the brutal calculus of attrition. General Renya Mutaguchi, commander of the 15th Army, had launched the Yugo offensive into India with the firm belief that Japanese spirit, seishin, would triumph over Allied material advantage. His soldiers were expected to march farther, carry more, and endure hardships that would shatter lesser men. The jungle was the great equalizer, a theatre of war where the industrial might of the United States was rendered irrelevant. An American factory could produce 1,000 tanks, but not one of them could navigate the dense, trackless terrain of the Arakan Mountains. A B-29 could level a city from 30,000 feet, but it couldn't find a single Japanese soldier hidden beneath the seamless green canopy. Logistics, the lifeblood of modern warfare, was a nightmare. The monsoon season turned the few existing trails into impassable rivers of mud. Every bullet, every bag of rice, every medical bandage had to be carried on the backs of mules or men. In this environment, Casualty evacuation for the Allies was, for all practical purposes, non-existent. A soldier wounded deep behind enemy lines faced a horrifying choice: be left for the enemy, or a slow, agonizing journey carried by his comrades, a journey that often killed both the wounded man and his exhausted bearers. The Japanese commanders knew this. They were certain of it. They planned around it. Every American soldier they wounded in a deep penetration raid was another soldier permanently removed from the battlefield. The jungle would finish the job. This cold, hard reality was the bedrock of their defensive strategy. They never knew the Americans were about to change the rules of the game entirely. What Sergeant Tanaka couldn't see was a miracle of ingenuity unfolding in that muddy clearing. The tiny aircraft was a Piper L-4 Grasshopper. It wasn't a fighter or a bomber. It was a militarized version of a civilian recreational plane, the Piper J-3 Cub. Its frame was welded steel tubing, its wings were fashioned from spruce and aluminum, and the entire aircraft was wrapped in a skin of doped fabric. It weighed just over 750 pounds empty. Its Continental engine produced a laughable 65 horsepower, less than a modern motorcycle. The cockpit was cramped, with the pilot in front and a single seat behind. It was designed to be simple, cheap, and easy to fly. To the Japanese military, steeped in a tradition of beautifully engineered, powerful war machines like the Mitsubishi Zero, the Grasshopper was an insult. It was a flimsy gadget, proof of American decadence and a fundamental misunderstanding of warfare. They laughed at it, until they understood its true purpose. The men who flew these machines were a special breed. They belonged to the 1st Air Commando Group, a unique American unit formed under the command of Colonel Philip Cochrane, with the express purpose of supporting long-range penetration groups operating deep in the Burmese jungle. These pilots were masters of a dangerous art known as short-field takeoff and landing. They could land these tiny planes on stretches of ground no bigger than a village road. They would survey a potential landing zone from the air, a sandbar, a paddy field, a hilltop clearing, and then bring the Grasshopper down with a terrifying combination of skill and courage, often skimming treetops on their final approach. In that clearing, American soldiers, part of the famous Merrill's Marauders, had worked frantically for an hour, hacking at the undergrowth with machetes to create a makeshift runway barely 200 feet long. As the L-4 touched down, its fat, low-pressure tires skimming over the mud, 2 medics rushed forward carrying a stretcher. On it lay a young private, his leg shattered by a Nambu machine gun burst, his face pale from blood loss and the onset of gangrene. In the Japanese army, this soldier's fate would have been sealed. His comrades would have taken his ammunition, perhaps shared a final cigarette, and left him with a grenade. It was a tragic but necessary part of their war. But the Americans were different. The pilot of the Grasshopper, without even shutting off his engine, twisted in his seat, and helped the medics carefully maneuver the wounded man into the space behind him. There was no proper seat, just a cramped compartment where the observer would normally sit. The private was laid diagonally, his head near the pilot's shoulder, his legs stretched into the rear fuselage. It was awkward, painful, and undignified. But it was life. Less than 2 minutes after landing, the pilot gave a thumbs up. He pushed the throttle forward, and the 65 horsepower engine screamed in protest. The little plane, now overloaded and heavy, lumbered through the mud, slowly, painfully gaining speed. For a terrifying moment, it seemed it would never lift off, that it would plunge into the wall of trees at the end of the clearing. But at the last possible second, the pilot hauled back on the stick, and the Grasshopper clawed its way into the air, its wings seeming to brush the leaves of the towering trees. It cleared the canopy and banked away, its sputtering engine carrying a single American soldier from certain death back to a field hospital where surgeons were waiting. Back on the ground, Sergeant Tanaka and his men listened. The sputtering sound faded into the rain. There had been no crash. They had heard no explosion. They couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. An airplane had landed in the heart of the jungle, in a clearing they thought was inaccessible to anything but foot soldiers, and had simply vanished, taking one of their targets with it. It was impossible. It was a trick of the light, a phantom, but the evidence was undeniable. The American pocket was still there, but it was now smaller by one wounded man who should have been dying. For the first time, a cold sliver of doubt entered Tanaka's heart. He was beginning to realize they weren't just fighting American soldiers. They were fighting American ingenuity, an industrial and logistical power that could conjure miracles out of thin air, a power that could reach into the very heart of the jungle they called their own and snatch its soldiers back from the clutches of death. The mayfly had just shown its sting, and the Japanese soldiers were shocked by the poison it delivered not to the body, but to the soul. The psychological impact of that first evacuation, and the thousands that would follow, rippled through the Japanese forces in Burma like a shockwave. It was an event so contrary to their understanding of war, so alien to their own military culture, that it bordered on the supernatural. For the Japanese soldier, the concept of the individual was subordinate to the whole. The army was the body. The soldier was a single blood cell, expendable for the health of the organism. This philosophy bred incredible bravery and a willingness to endure unimaginable hardship, but it also fostered a deep-seated, unspoken fatalism. Once a soldier was gravely wounded in a remote location, his war was over, his spirit would be honored, his family notified of his glorious sacrifice, but his physical body was forfeit, another offering to the jungle. This was the natural order of things. The Americans, however, were demonstrating a completely different philosophy, and they were doing it with these absurd little airplanes. Suddenly, the natural order was turned upside down. Japanese patrols would lay a perfect ambush, wound several American soldiers, and then melt back into the jungle to wait for disease and infection to finish the job. They would listen for the groans of the wounded, the sounds of despair they knew so well. Instead, they heard the sputtering cough of a grasshopper engine. They would watch in stunned disbelief as a tiny L-4, sometimes 2 or 3 of them, would appear in the sky, circle like buzzards, and then drop into a nearby clearing that seemed no bigger than a courtyard. Minutes later, they would climb back out, heavy with their cargo of saved men. The Japanese soldiers couldn't believe it. They had been taught that Americans were soft, individualistic merchants, incapable of true sacrifice. Yet here was evidence of a system that went to extraordinary, almost insane lengths to preserve the life of a single, ordinary soldier. The pilots of these L-birds were taking risks that would have earned a fighter ace a medal. They were flying unarmored aircraft into active combat zones. They flew low and slow, making them easy targets for any soldier with a rifle. They landed on terrain that was barely controlled, often with Japanese patrols just hundreds of yards away, hidden in the tree line. A single machine gun burst could shred their fabric skin and kill the pilot, yet they came anyway. This dedication was baffling. It was illogical. Why risk a pilot and an airplane, valuable military assets, to save one wounded infantryman, a man who might be too injured to ever fight again? The question haunted Japanese soldiers and junior officers. They had no answer, because the action was rooted in a cultural value system they did not share. To the Americans, every soldier saved was a victory. It was a promise kept, a demonstration to every man on the front line that he would not be abandoned. This promise was a more powerful morale booster than any propaganda speech. It gave the American soldier an incredible psychological resilience. He could push deeper into the jungle, take greater risks, knowing that if the worst happened, a strange little plane might just appear out of the sky to pull him out of hell. This new American capability began to warp the tactical calculations of the Japanese forces. An ambush was no longer a guaranteed attritional victory. Wounding an American soldier no longer meant killing him. The Japanese began to specifically target the grasshoppers. A lone L-4 circling overhead became a priority target, more so than a group of infantrymen. They would set up machine guns overlooking clearings they suspected might be used as makeshift landing strips. But the American pilots were clever. They were called puddle jumpers and flying jeeps for a reason. They could land almost anywhere. If one clearing was under fire, they would find another. The pilots and the ground troops developed a system of signals using colored smoke and fabric panels to communicate the status of a landing zone. The entire operation was a masterpiece of improvisation, a testament to American flexibility and bottom-up problem-solving. A Japanese report from the period, captured by Allied forces, revealed their utter confusion. An intelligence officer wrote, "The enemy is utilizing small, kite-like aircraft for the removal of their wounded. These machines require no airfield, landing in any small open space. They appear to have no combat capability, yet their effect on our strategy of isolation is significant. Our soldiers are disturbed by this. They see the enemy caring for their fallen in a way our own army cannot. It creates a sense of envy and hopelessness. That last word, hopelessness, was key. The Grasshopper, with its 65 horsepower engine and fabric skin, was generating a sense of hopelessness in one of the toughest, most fanatical armies in the world. The symbolism of the little plane was potent. The Japanese soldier fought with the Type 99 Arisaka rifle, a superb and reliable weapon. The American soldier fought with the M1 Garand. Both were tools of death. But the L-4 Grasshopper was not a tool of death, it was a tool of life. And in the context of the brutal Burmese jungle, the power to grant life was a far more shocking and revolutionary capability than the power to deal death. Sergeant Tanaka saw it again a week later. His platoon had cornered another group of Americans. During the firefight, they saw a soldier fall, clutching his stomach. The battle raged for an hour before the Americans pulled back, dragging their wounded comrade with them. Tanaka's men gave chase, confident the wounded man would slow them down. They would catch them and finish the job. But then they heard it again, the put-put-put of the mayfly. They crested a ridge just in time to see the L-4 taking off from a narrow sandbar on the bend of a river. As it climbed, a Japanese soldier, enraged by the sight, raised his rifle and fired a full clip at the plane. The bullets ripped through the fabric on the fuselage, leaving a series of small, dark holes. But the plane didn't falter. It didn't explode or fall from the sky. It simply kept climbing, its engine sputtering defiantly, and disappeared over the horizon. The soldier lowered his rifle, his expression one of pure frustration. They had hit it, but it didn't matter. The flimsy plane had absorbed the damage and carried on, its mission complete. It was like fighting a ghost. The Grasshopper represented an idea that the Japanese military machine was fundamentally unequipped to fight. The idea that the life of an individual soldier was worth more than the machine he fought in. It was a weapon of compassion, and against the grim fatalism of the Japanese military code, it was devastatingly effective. The Japanese were stunned. They had never expected that the Americans' greatest weapon in the jungle wouldn't be a tank or a bomber, but a simple, unarmed ambulance with wings. The arrival of the 1st Air Commando Group in Burma in early 1944 was a direct response to the unique horrors of the campaign. The British General Orde Wingate had pioneered the concept of long-range penetration groups, known as the Chindits, who would operate for months at a time deep behind Japanese lines, supplied entirely by air. The American equivalent, Merrill's Marauders, officially the 5,307th Composite Unit, provisional, adopted similar tactics. These operations were incredibly audacious, but they came at a staggering cost. For every soldier killed by enemy fire, several more were incapacitated by malaria, typhus, dysentery, and exhaustion. The jungle was a more relentless killer than the Japanese. In the early days of these operations, a wounded or seriously ill soldier was doomed. His evacuation would require a team of 8 to 10 men to carry him, men who were already overloaded and weakened. It slowed the entire column, making them vulnerable to attack. More often than not, the grim decision was made to leave the man behind in a hidden camp with a few days' rations and the hope that he might be found later, a hope that was almost never realized. This reality was a cancer on the morale of the troops. They fought two enemies, the Japanese soldier they could see and the fear of abandonment they could not. The commanders, including General Vinegar Joe Stilwell and the eccentric Wingate, knew this was unsustainable. They needed a third option, a way to bridge the impossible distance between a wounded soldier deep in the jungle and a field hospital. The solution came from Colonel Cochrane and his second-in-command, Colonel John Allison. They proposed something radical, using light liaison aircraft, which were typically used for artillery spotting and reconnaissance, as frontline air ambulances. The idea was met with skepticism. The official liaison plane, the Stinson L-5 Sentinel, was larger and more powerful than the L-4, but it was also heavier and required a longer runway. The theatre was flooded, however, with the much smaller and lighter L-4 Grasshoppers. They were cheap, plentiful, and crucially, they could land and take off from absurdly short and unprepared strips. The decision was made to experiment. The challenge was immense. Burma's terrain is some of the most hostile on Earth, a chaotic landscape of steep, jungle-covered hills, deep ravines, and winding rivers. The weather was atrocious, with violent winds, thick fog, and monsoonal downpours that could reduce visibility to zero in seconds. There were new airfields, new radio navigation aids, new emergency landing sites. The pilots would have to navigate by map, compass, and sheer instinct, flying just over the treetops to find their targets. The process itself was a marvel of battlefield innovation. When a Chindit or Marauder column had a casualty they couldn't treat, they would find the best available clearing. This might be a dry rice paddy, a sandbar, or a small hilltop. The soldiers, already exhausted from marching and fighting, would then set to work as pioneers, clearing obstacles with machetes and small explosives to create a runway. A former British Chindit officer later recalled, "You'd look at this little patch of mud and scrub, maybe 100 yards long if you were lucky, and you'd think, no aircraft in the world can land here. Then, an hour later, you'd hear that little engine, and this bloody American pilot would bring his kite down as gentle as a feather. It was pure magic." The pilots themselves were often older, experienced civilian aviators from the pre-war era, men who knew how to fly by the seat of their pants. They flew without armor, without parachutes, and without guns. Their only defenses were their skill and the jungle canopy itself. They named their planes with grim humor the Green Hornet, Jungle Jitney, Burma Buggy. One pilot, Lieutenant Colonel James J.T. Robbins, became a legend, personally evacuating hundreds of wounded soldiers. In one instance, he landed his L-4 on a narrow mountain ridge with a sheer drop on both sides to rescue a wounded British soldier. As he was taking off, Japanese soldiers appeared and opened fire. Robbins felt his plane shudder as bullets ripped through the fuselage, but he managed to get airborne and fly his patient back to safety. The Japanese soldiers, observing these operations from their hidden positions, were utterly mystified. They were witnessing a logistical chain that seemed to defy all logic. They saw the enemy create an airfield out of nothing in a matter of hours. They saw a flimsy plane land and take off in conditions they considered impossible for flight. But the most shocking part was the final destination. Where did these planes go? The answer was another layer of the American logistical miracle that the Japanese never expected. The L-4 seconds would fly the wounded men to a larger, semi-prepared strip, often a dry riverbed, where a bigger transport plane, usually a C-47 Skytrain, would be waiting. The C-47 was the workhorse of the Allied Air Forces, a rugged and reliable transport plane. It could land on rough fields that would be unusable by bombers. Once the wounded soldier was transferred from the Grasshopper to the C-47, he was then flown hundreds of miles back to a fully equipped American field hospital in India. A soldier who was shot in the morning deep inside Japanese-controlled territory could be on an operating table, under the care of trained surgeons, by that evening. For the Japanese soldier, this was science fiction. Their own medical system was rudimentary at best. A soldier wounded at the front would be taken to a local aid station, often just a bamboo hut, where a medic with minimal supplies would do what he could. If the wound was serious, there was no hope. The idea of an organized, multi-stage evacuation system involving two different types of aircraft to save a single private was so far beyond their capabilities that it was almost incomprehensible. They couldn't believe the sheer scale of the resources the Americans were willing to expend on one man. It was a terrifying revelation. If the Americans could do this for their wounded, what else could they do? The little Grasshopper was no longer a joke. It was a symbol of an enemy whose power was not just in their weapons, but in a vast, invisible network of production, logistics, and a core belief in the value of every single life. This was a form of warfare for which their training in Bushido had left them completely unprepared. The tactical doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Army was built on the principle of offensive, aggressive action. Their soldiers were trained to advance, to infiltrate, to attack. The defense was seen as a temporary measure, and retreat was considered the ultimate dishonor. This mindset was reflected in their logistics, which were notoriously Spartan. A Japanese division on the march was expected to live off the land, foraging for food and supplies as it advanced. Medical support was an afterthought. The focus was on getting as many men to the front as possible. What happened to them after they were wounded was a secondary, almost trivial concern. This system worked, after a fashion, in the early years of the war against less prepared opponents. But in Burma, against the deep penetration tactics of the Allies, it collapsed completely. The jungle provided little to forage, and the Allied air forces systematically destroyed Japanese supply lines. The result was an army that was constantly on the verge of starvation and riddled with disease. A Japanese soldier who fell ill or was wounded was not just a casualty. He was a burden his unit could not afford. The contrast with the American system, symbolized by the L-4 Grasshopper, was brutal and demoralizing. Japanese soldiers, captured during the latter stages of the Burma Campaign, frequently spoke of the little planes during their interrogations. Their testimony reveals a consistent pattern of initial ridicule followed by shock, envy, and finally, a corrosive despair. One captured corporal from the 33rd Division stated, "We thought they were cowards, needing these little toys to save them. A true Japanese soldier would die where he fell. But then we saw our own men, brave men, dying of gangrene from a small wound, while the Americans plucked their soldiers from death like a god reaching from the sky. It is hard to maintain your spirit when you see such a thing." This envy was a powerful psychological weapon. The Japanese propaganda machine had relentlessly portrayed the Allies, particularly the Americans, as soft, materialistic, and lacking the spiritual fiber for a protracted, brutal war. Every grasshopper that landed in a jungle clearing and flew a wounded man to safety was a direct, irrefutable contradiction of that propaganda. It wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a sign of incredible strength. It was the strength of a nation so rich it could afford to treat every soldier as priceless. It was the strength of an industrial base that could produce not just thousands of fighters and bombers, but also thousands of these simple, life-saving utility planes. Republic Aviation produced over 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts. Piper Aircraft produced nearly 20,000 of its J-3 Cub and its military variants. The Japanese military planners, who struggled to produce a fraction of those numbers, were stunned by the sheer scale of American production. The sound of the Grasshopper's engine became a recurring motif in the psychological landscape of the Japanese soldier in Burma. At first, it was a nuisance, a silly noise that barely registered. As the campaign wore on, that sputtering sound began to trigger a Pavlovian response. For an American soldier, it was the sound of hope, the most beautiful music in the world. For a Japanese soldier, it was the sound of their own abandonment. It was a reminder that their enemy had a lifeline that they did not. It underscored the terrible truth of their situation. They had been sent into the jungle to win or to die, with no other options. The American soldier, by contrast, had a third option: to be saved. This disparity in hope was as tactically significant as any disparity in firepower. A soldier who believes he might be saved will fight to the last, protecting his wounded comrades and holding his position until help arrives. A soldier who believes he is doomed is more likely to break, to make a final, desperate banzai charge, or to simply fade into the jungle and die of his wounds and despair. The Japanese commanders were not ignorant of this. They saw the effect the evacuations were having on their men's morale. They issued orders to shoot down the ambulance planes on site, classifying them as legitimate military targets. But it was difficult. The L-4 seconds were elusive, flying low and using the terrain for cover. And for every one they managed to shoot down, 10 more seemed to appear. The American pilots, for their part, understood the profound psychological impact of their missions. They were not just flying planes, they were delivering hope. One pilot, quoted in a post-war history of the unit, said, "You'd land in some godforsaken mudhole, and these guys would look at you like you were an angel from heaven. They'd be covered in mud and leeches, exhausted, some of them wounded, but the sight of our little plane just lit them up. And when you took off with one of their buddies, you could see the relief on their faces. They knew they weren't alone out there." This sense of not being alone was the Grasshopper's true payload. The Japanese soldiers, in contrast, were profoundly alone. Their supply lines were cut, their commanders were distant figures issuing impossible orders, and their comrades were dying around them from starvation and disease at a rate that dwarfed combat losses. They had been told the jungle was their ally, but it had become their prison, and the sputtering engine of the little American plane was the sound of the jailer walking past their cell, a constant reminder of a freedom they would never have. Sergeant Tanaka, huddled under the relentless rain, came to understand this. He had once laughed at the mayfly. Now he dreaded its sound. It was the sound of a different way of war, a way he couldn't comprehend but whose superiority was becoming crushingly, terrifyingly obvious. The Americans weren't just conquering the jungle, they were conquering the very idea of hopelessness. The success of the L-4 Grasshopper as a casualty evacuation platform in Burma did not remain a localized, improvised tactic for long. The results were so dramatic and the impact on troop morale so positive that the concept was quickly formalized and expanded. What began as the desperate experiment of the 1st Air Commando Group became standard operating procedure for Allied long-range penetration units. The number of evacuations grew exponentially. In one 5-month period during the height of the campaign, these light aircraft evacuated over 5,000 Allied soldiers from behind enemy lines. 5,000 men who, in any previous war and in any other army in that theatre, would have been condemned to death. The Japanese military simply had no counter for this. They could not match the capability, and more importantly, they could not comprehend the philosophy behind it. The very existence of this aerial ambulance service was a strategic blow. The Japanese strategy in Burma was to make the cost of fighting there so high, the attrition so unbearable, that the Allies would be forced to abandon the campaign. The Grasshopper directly attacked that strategy. By dramatically increasing the survival rate of experienced soldiers, it preserved the Allies' most valuable asset, their combat manpower. The Japanese were shocked to find that American units, even after sustaining heavy casualties in a firefight, could be reinforced and back to operational strength in a fraction of the time it took their own forces. The system became increasingly sophisticated. The pioneers on the ground became experts at constructing L-strips. They developed techniques for stabilizing muddy ground with bamboo mats. The pilots refined their techniques for overloaded short-field takeoffs, sometimes getting a push from the soldiers on the ground to gain those first few precious feet of speed. The coordination between ground and air became seamless. The entire operation was a microcosm of the broader American approach to war: identify a problem, innovate a solution using available technology, and then systematize it on a massive scale. While the Japanese army was still relying on the spiritual power of its soldiers, the Americans were applying the principles of a Ford assembly line to the problem of saving lives in combat. The L-4 Grasshopper, a machine with a production cost of less than $2,500, was enabling multi-million-dollar military operations to succeed. The Japanese never saw it coming. They were prepared to fight against tanks, bombers, and infantry. They were not prepared to fight against a logistical system of such profound efficiency and compassion. Their entire military culture, which glorified death in battle, was psychologically short-circuited by an enemy who seemed to glorify survival. This cultural shock extended beyond the battlefield. On the rare occasions the Japanese captured an American soldier, they were often surprised by the man's physical condition and personal effects. Even deep in the jungle, the American G.I. was typically better fed and better equipped than his Japanese counterpart. He had rations that were scientifically designed for nutrition, medicine to combat malaria, and even small comforts like cigarettes and chocolate. To the starving Japanese soldiers, this was evidence of the decadent materialism they had been taught to despise. But seeing the lengths the American army would go to rescue one of these soft soldiers created a confusing cognitive dissonance. How could an army be both soft and so incredibly powerful? The Grasshopper was the ultimate expression of this paradox. It was a soft, fragile machine, yet it projected a hard, undeniable power, the power to defy the jungle, to cheat death, and to sustain an army in a place where no army should have been able to survive. The Japanese soldier's world was one of grim, unchangeable realities. The American soldier's world, it seemed, was one where reality could be bent and reshaped by ingenuity and industrial will. The legend of the puddle jumpers grew. Stories circulated through the Allied ranks, further boosting morale. There was the story of the pilot who landed in a clearing that was actively being shelled by Japanese mortars, loaded his wounded man, and took off as shells burst around him. There was the story of a pilot who, unable to land, dropped a medical kit with a note attached to a wounded soldier, promising to return the next day, and did. These were not just stories, they were parables demonstrating the core promise the US Army made to its soldiers. For the Japanese, there were no such stories. There were only tales of heroic death, of starving garrisons fighting to the last man. The sound of the grasshopper became the soundtrack to their defeat. It was the whisper of American superiority, a constant, irritating noise that told them their sacrifices were being systematically negated by an enemy who refused to play by the jungle's brutal rules. Sergeant Tanaka heard it in his sleep. In his feverish dreams, brought on by malnutrition and malaria, the sputtering engine of the mayfly was the sound of his own world unraveling. It was the sound of his own generals' promises turning to lies. They had promised him that Japanese spirit would conquer American machines, but what he was witnessing was a machine born of a different kind of spirit, a spirit that valued the life of a single man so highly it would move heaven and earth, or at least a small airplane, to save him. He couldn't believe it, but he could not deny it either. The evidence was in the sky above him every day. The war in Burma was being decided not by the clash of steel, but by the clash of two opposing philosophies, and the sputtering little grasshopper was the arbiter of that contest. By early 1945, the Japanese 15th Army in Burma was no longer a coherent fighting force. It was a shattered, starving mob, retreating in disarray, relentlessly hounded by Allied forces and the very jungle it had once sought as an ally. The Yugo offensive had ended in one of the worst military disasters in Japanese history. Of the over 100,000 men who began the invasion of India, more than 65,000 became casualties, the vast majority dying from disease and starvation rather than combat. The American logistical and medical system, of which the L-4 Grasshopper was a vital and iconic part, had been a key factor in this victory. It allowed the Allied deep penetration groups to remain in the field, to harass Japanese supply lines, and to survive the ravages of the jungle in a way their enemy could not. The Grasshopper had been an instrument of attrition, not by killing the enemy, but by preventing the jungle from killing its own soldiers. It was a complete reversal of the Japanese strategic plan. The weapon they thought would break the Allies, the jungle itself, had been turned against them. The little plane that the Japanese soldiers had laughed at had become a symbol of their undoing. It represented the totality of American power. It was born from a civilian industrial base that could pivot to war production on an unimaginable scale. It was flown by skilled pilots produced by a training system that was the largest and most sophisticated in the world. And it was deployed in service of a philosophy that held the individual soldier as a precious resource, a philosophy that fostered a level of morale and resilience that Japanese Seishin alone could not overcome. The war in Burma was a war of logistics, and the L-4 was the ultimate logistical tool. It was the final, crucial link in a chain that stretched from the factories of America, across the Pacific, over the hump of the Himalayas, and into a tiny, muddy clearing in the middle of enemy territory to save the life of one man. The Japanese military, with its overstretched supply lines and disregard for its own soldiers' welfare, could never hope to compete with such a system. They had brought swords of spiritual fervor to a gunfight of industrial logistics. In the final months of the war, the role of the Grasshopper continued. They spotted targets for artillery, they flew supplies to isolated outposts, they carried messages and commanders, but their most celebrated role remained that of the air ambulance. They were the gentle saviors in a theater of unparalleled brutality. After the war, when Allied officials pieced together the history of the campaign from captured documents and interrogations of Japanese survivors, the story of the kite planes came up again and again. High-ranking Japanese officers admitted they had completely underestimated the impact of light aircraft on the campaign. They had been fixated on Allied air power in the form of fighters and bombers, and had completely missed the strategic revolution happening just over the treetops. One former staff officer confessed, "We knew how to fight against machines of war. We did not know how to fight against a system that seemed to care so much. It was a shock to our military spirit to see how they valued their men. Our own system demanded sacrifice. Theirs seemed designed to prevent it." The legacy of the L-4 Grasshopper is a testament to the idea that the most effective weapons are not always the biggest or the most powerful. In the green hell of Burma, a 750-pound airplane with a 65-horsepower engine had a greater strategic impact on morale than a squadron of heavy bombers. It proved that the American way of war was not just about overwhelming firepower, but about overwhelming ingenuity, overwhelming logistics, and an overwhelming belief in the worth of the individual. The sputtering engine, once a source of Japanese amusement, became the death rattle of their ambitions in Southeast Asia. It was the sound of a promise being kept. It was the sound of hope, and in the end, it was the sound of victory. The Japanese soldiers who had stood in the jungle and stared up in disbelief at the flimsy mayfly were witnessing more than just a clever tactic. They were witnessing the reason they were doomed to lose the war. They were watching a nation that had mastered the art of production and the science of logistics deploy it all in the service of a single, powerful idea that no soldier would be left behind. They had laughed until they finally understood that the little plane wasn't a sign of American weakness. It was the ultimate symbol of a strength they could never hope to match.